For most soldiers, getting promoted means being safer. You move from the front lines to the rear, you take fewer risks. This may be true for many armies, but in Rome, things were exactly the opposite. The moment you got promoted, you didn't feel safe, because as your rank rose, you were sent to more dangerous places. You became more visible, and for the enemy, you became the primary target. So in Rome, getting promoted didn't mean staying alive, it meant getting even closer to death. So why? Why did Rome put its most experienced soldiers in the greatest danger? The Centurion was the backbone of the Roman military system. He commanded 80 men, maintained the discipline of his century, led from the front in battle, and was the point at which the institutional authority of Rome made direct contact with the individual soldier. He was also the most likely officer in the Roman army to die in any given engagement. The tactical position of the Centurion in Roman battle formation explains the mortality rate with brutal clarity. The Centurion stood at the right front of his century, the most exposed position in the formation, the place where the fighting was heaviest, and the enemy concentrated their efforts on breaking through. This was not an accident or a convention that could be adjusted for individual preference. The Centurion's position at the front was the source of his authority. A man who led from behind was not a Roman centurion in any meaningful sense. The position created the authority, and the authority required the position, and the position killed centurions at a rate that far exceeded the mortality of the common soldiers they commanded. The archaeological and documentary evidence for centurion casualties is striking. The tombstones of centurions from military cemeteries across the empire show death in service at rates that confirm what the tactical analysis would predict. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, which provides some of the most detailed battle narratives in Roman literature, records centurion casualties with a specificity that suggests Caesar himself understood this reality. In the accounts of difficult engagements, the centurions are often the named dead, the men whose loss he records individually because their specific deaths shape the course of the fighting. Livy, writing about the battles of the Republican period, includes accounts of centurions fighting on after taking wounds that would have removed a common soldier from the line. A centurion who retreated from the front to tend to his wounds was abandoning the position that defined his authority. The institutional culture of the centurionate therefore produced men who fought with wounds that should have stopped them, who died in position rather than falling back, and whose wounds, when they survived, were documented as evidence of service rather than as records of suffering. The centurion's body was, in a specific institutional sense, the property of his century, to be spent where the century needed it spent. The physical requirements of the centurion position added another layer of danger. The centurion was typically more heavily equipped than his men, a transverse helmet crest that made him visually distinctive, greaves that common soldiers did not wear, armor of better quality. These markers of rank that communicated his authority to his century also communicated his identity to the enemy. An experienced enemy formation that understood Roman tactical organization knew exactly what the transverse crest meant and what the elimination of its wearer would accomplish. Killing the centurion disrupted the century's command, shook its discipline, and created the kind of crisis at the point of engagement that could collapse a formation. The specific battles where Caesar names centurion casualties make the pattern visible. At the Sabis River against the Nervii in 57 BC, the Roman formation was nearly broken, and Caesar records the deaths of centurions by name. men whose loss he describes as the hinge on which the crisis turned. At Gergovia in 52 BC, the assault that went wrong cost Rome more centurions than any other engagement of the Gallic Wars. Caesar does not present these casualties as tragic accidents. He presents them as the expected cost of the positions these men occupied. The centurionate produced exactly this kind of loss, and the men who held the rank understood that when they accepted it. The aquilifer carried the eagle. The signifer carried the century standard. These were not ceremonial roles filled by decorative soldiers. They were combat positions that combined the worst features of visibility, encumbrance, and tactical importance into jobs that killed the men who held them at exceptional rates. The aquilifer, who carried the legion's eagle standard, was the most important non-commissioned figure in the entire legion. The eagle was the sacred heart of the formation. Its loss was an institutional catastrophe that shamed the legion for generations and required recovery operations that could consume years of campaigning. Precisely because the eagle was so important, every enemy commander who faced a Roman legion understood that capturing or destroying the eagle was the single most demoralizing blow they could strike. The aquilifer walked into every battle as the primary target of every enemy soldier who understood what he was carrying. The tactical problem of the aquilifer's position was compounded by the equipment. Carrying the eagle standard required one hand, which meant fighting with one weapon rather than two, carrying the shield in an awkward position, and being unable to respond to lateral threats in the way that a fully equipped soldier could. The aquilifer was visually unmistakable, operationally encumbered, and of the highest possible value to the enemy. A combination of characteristics that made his survival in serious engagements a matter of constant improvisation rather than standard tactics. The signifer's position was different but not safer. The century's standard communicated orders in battle: raise it, lower it, move it, in ways that kept the formation oriented and responsive in the chaos of engagement. This communication function made the signifer as important to the century's cohesion as the centurion himself, and it made him a target for the same reason. An enemy that could silence the standard and disorient the century while simultaneously killing the centurion had the means to collapse the formation from inside, and experienced enemies knew this. The signifer went into battle as conspicuous as the centurion, performing a function as critical as the centurion, and dying at comparable rates. The pay for these positions reflected the danger, at least partially. The aquilifer received double the standard legionary pay. The signifer received 1.5 times. These were among the highest pay grades available to non-commissioned soldiers. The Romans were willing to compensate men for taking on the most conspicuous and dangerous positions in the formation, and the compensation was real, but it was also, for many of the men who held these positions, posthumous in effect. The money accumulated and passed to their heirs rather than being spent by the men who earned it. What the centurion, the aquilifer, and the signifer shared was visibility. And in ancient battle, visibility was a significant form of danger. The Roman military's brilliant solution to the command and control problem of ancient warfare was to make officers and standard bearers visually distinctive so that soldiers could find them in the chaos of combat. The same solution that made Roman formations more controllable than their enemies also made their key personnel more killable. The transverse crest of the centurion's helmet running side to side rather than front to back like a common soldier's, was visible from 40 or 50 meters in the dust and press of ancient battle. It told every Roman soldier where the front of the century was, where authority resided, and where to look for direction when the noise and confusion of battle made verbal communication impossible. It also told every enemy soldier the same things. The crest was a tactical communication device that communicated to both sides simultaneously, and the communication it gave the enemy was precisely the location of the man whose elimination would do the most immediate damage. The primus pilus, the most senior centurion in the legion, commanded the first cohort and held the highest non-commissioned rank in the Roman military hierarchy. He had typically served for decades, survived campaigns across multiple theaters, and accumulated a level of tactical experience that was irreplaceable. He was also, by the logic of the system, required to be in the most dangerous position at the most critical moment of any engagement. His seniority did not protect him. It placed him where the fighting was hardest and kept him there by the same institutional logic that had created the centurionate in the first place. Tacitus, writing about the campaigns on the Rhine frontier under Germanicus in the early 1st century AD, describes centurion casualties with the same specificity that Caesar had used a generation earlier. His accounts of the difficult fighting in the German forests identify centurions by name, note where they fell in the formation, and record their deaths as moments when the battle's balance shifted. The pattern across 2 generations of writers describing different campaigns in different theaters was consistent. Centurions died at the front. They died at the moments of greatest crisis, and their deaths were recorded because their specific deaths mattered to how the battle developed. That was the position. That was the promotion. For soldiers whose abilities and connections allowed them to advance beyond the centurionate, the trajectory of promotion sometimes led toward the imperial court and the Praetorian Guard. This might seem like the culmination of a military career, the safest, most prestigious, and most comfortable posting in the Roman military. The historical record suggests a more complicated reality. The Praetorian Guard was headquartered in Rome, received higher pay than legionary soldiers, served in better conditions, and was physically close to the center of power. It was also the institution most directly involved in the specific Roman military tradition of making and unmaking emperors. Between the reign of Augustus and the end of the 3rd century, Praetorian soldiers and officers participated in the assassination or forced abdication of multiple emperors. In each of these events, the Praetorians who had backed the losing side faced exactly the consequences that such choices produced. A senior officer in the Praetorian Guard was, by definition, close to whoever held imperial power. Closeness to power in the Roman imperial system was not the safe position it might appear. Emperors who felt threatened by competent, popular, or ambitious subordinates disposed of them. Emperors who were themselves deposed brought down the officers who had been identified with their regime. The Praetorian prefects, the most senior military officers in the empire, the men who commanded the guard and had direct daily access to the emperor, died violently at a rate that compares poorly with the centurions of frontier legions. Sejanus, who served as Praetorian prefect under Tiberius and accumulated more personal power than any non-emperor in Roman history to that point, was executed in 31 AD along with his children and many of his associates. Macro, who succeeded him and helped bring him down, was forced to suicide under Caligula. Burrus, who served under Nero and wielded genuine influence over the early part of the reign, died under circumstances that ancient sources regard as suspicious. The pattern was not coincidental. The Praetorian prefecture was the most powerful non-imperial position in the Roman world, and the Roman world had a consistent way of dealing with powerful men who were not emperors. Behind the specific roles of centurion and standard-bearer was a broader principle that shaped Roman military culture from the lowest soldier to the highest commander. The man who distinguished himself became the man who was watched, and the man who was watched in Roman military and political life was the man whose career could end abruptly. A soldier who performed exceptionally in battle received decorations, torques, armbands, phalae, crowns of specific types for specific achievements. These decorations were worn on formal occasions and communicated the soldier's combat history to everyone who saw him. They also communicated to every superior officer in his chain of command that this man had the kind of ability and ambition that produced distinguished service. In the Roman military system, this was not always the uncomplicated advantage it appeared. The decorated soldier was visible in a second sense beyond the battlefield. He was visible in the institutional records, in the memory of commanders who had promoted him, and in the awareness of rivals who had not been decorated. The Roman military culture that celebrated exceptional service also created a specific anxiety around it. The man who was too conspicuously successful accumulated enemies alongside his honors. Every torque on his chest was a statement about his abilities that someone above him in the hierarchy had to evaluate and decide whether to reward further or to regard as a threat. The decorations that marked achievement were also the decorations that marked a man worth watching, and in the Roman system, being worth watching cut in both directions. The Roman political culture of the imperial period was one in which exceptional ability, especially military ability, was a potential threat to whoever held power. Emperors who felt secure could reward talented generals with further commands and greater responsibility. Emperors who felt insecure, which was most of them, most of the time, could see a successful and popular general as a rival rather than a servant. The most successful military commanders of the imperial period navigated this reality with various degrees of skill, and the ones who navigated it badly ended their careers in exile or ended their lives rather more abruptly. The career arc of a highly successful Roman soldier thus contained an internal contradiction that the system never resolved. The qualities that produced promotion, courage, tactical skill, leadership ability, the capacity to inspire loyalty in subordinates, were precisely the qualities that made the promoted man dangerous to the people above him. Getting noticed was necessary for advancement. Getting too noticed was often fatal. The Roman military career was, for its most talented participants, a sustained exercise in performing just well enough to advance without performing so well that advancement became the last thing that happened to them. The men who navigated this successfully were often those who combined genuine military ability with a particular kind of institutional intelligence, the understanding of when to be visibly excellent and when to defer, when to accept the dangerous position, and when to let someone else have the glory. Agrippa, who was arguably the most militarily capable man in Augustus's circle and who won 3 major naval victories in a single decade, spent his career making Augustus look like the author of victories that Agrippa had planned and executed. He died in bed at 51, which by the standards of the Roman military career at his level of prominence was an extraordinary achievement. He understood the transaction the system required and paid its price willingly. One of the reasons the Roman army was so powerful was that they positioned their soldiers correctly. The most experienced and high-ranking soldiers were on the front lines. They bore the greatest responsibility. But at the same time, they faced the greatest risk. Promotion wasn't just about earning respect. It meant a higher salary, a higher status, but at the same time, it meant being closer to death. That's why not everyone in Rome wanted to rise through the ranks, because for some, the fear of death outweighed everything else. But still, there were those who took that risk, because that position was the highest rank a Roman soldier could aspire to. Now ask yourself this question. If you were a soldier back then, would you still want to be promoted, even knowing all this? If your answer is yes, what would drive you to do it?